Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. For any business, managing working capital is absolutely vital. Put simply, working capital is the part of a company's trading that hasn't yet translated into cash flow. It provides an insight into the health of a company and the way a business operates. Every year, the team at McGrathNicol Advisory release their working capital report, revealing how much cash is locked up within Australian companies and how they stack up against the rest of the world. Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles are partners at McGrathNicol Advisory and co-authors of the 12th Annual Working Capital Report. McGrathNicol's a great supporter of this podcast. Jason, Sean, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Great to be here, Sean.
Hey, Sean.
Sean, I'm going to start with you. You've recently released this 12th edition of the McGrathNicol Working Capital Report. Talk us through some of the headline results, how working capital cycles have changed in comparison to last year, and just very quickly, how you achieve these results. Just a few definitions for us.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I might start there. So we look at the length of the net working capital cycle and how that's changed year on year. And there's three fundamental parts to the net working capital cycle. There's the length of time it takes companies to convert their sales into cash, so the debtors or collection cycle. There's the amount of inventory they hold, so the length of the inventory cycle, and there's the length of time that they pay their suppliers on, or the payables or the creditors cycles. So those three parts of the cycle work together and form the net working capital cycle. So we will get working capital performance on those metrics. And just to give you a bit of context, this year the report that we wrote covered the working capital performance of 124 ASX-listed companies across 7 sectors. We look at sectors like construction and retail and food and beverage. And at a headline level this year, our research showed that business leaders found it hard to manage working capital. The average working capital load actually increased in 6 of the 7 sectors that we looked at. And each part of the working capital cycle I just described got longer. And for companies that were able to achieve revenue growth, the majority of those companies needed more working capital or a greater investment in working capital to deliver that growth.
Okay, Jason, the average day's working capital increased by 0.4 days, locking up an additional $754 million. What does that mean? And what were some of the key drivers for this year's increase in days working capital?
Yes, as Sean said, it got more difficult, and 0.4 days doesn't sound like a lot, does it? And it certainly doesn't sound like a lot in the context of the last few years. Since COVID in 2019, the subsequent years that we've reported against, there's been much more jagged movements in that net working capital. So 0.4 of a day seems quite small compared to, say, last year, which was almost a week. So it's quite small as a net number, but what we always talk about, and Sean described those 3 elements, working capital is all about the detail and all about the individual elements. So we actually saw the DSO, or that length of time it takes to collect from your customers, increase, and that went up by a day. We also then saw the average inventory holdings go up by 3.1 days. And so that's quite a big increase when you think about the value of inventory across all of those entities. And the way that was mitigated was companies on average paid their suppliers more slowly. That's really an interesting reversal of last year. When we were talking about this report last year, we were saying what great corporate citizens Australians are in the corporate world, because even when they collect more quickly from their customers, they're passing that straight on and paying their suppliers more quickly. This year, it's the reverse of that. It's been a little more difficult to collect. And the way that they've mitigated or conserved cash is to pay suppliers more slowly, which is quite interesting reversal.
Yeah, I mean, paying more slowly, is there some way we can put a value on whether that's a good or a bad thing in terms of the health of businesses?
I think what it is, it's a short-term measure. It's certainly the way when we talk about how you impact your working capital cycle, one of the ones that's the most immediately in your control is to stop paying people or pay much more slowly. But just saying that, you can tell that that's a short-term measure. So it certainly is a quick one. It certainly is one that will conserve your cash, but it's something that puts pressure on your supply chain. It puts pressure on all of your relationships. And when you are seeking to strengthen relationships, and what the last thing you want is for a key supplier to either leave you, not be interested in supplying to you because you're a bad payer, or even worse, to fail.
Yep.
So it's a short-term measure. We don't like seeing working capital cycles managed or cash flow managed necessarily by paying people more slowly.
Okay, Sean, the research focuses on the listed end of the market. What do the findings mean for mid-market or smaller operators?
Yeah, Sean, it's a question we often get asked about our research, given that we do focus on the ASX-listed companies and the publicly available information. And Jason really sort of hit the nail on the head. The paying suppliers more slowly was the key working capital management lever used in 2024 across our sample. And we also know that mid-market or smaller operators often form a big part of the supply chains for those larger businesses that we research. So the reality is that it has to land somewhere, and the impact of slower payments often lands in the mid-market, and it puts pressure on their ability then to pay their suppliers, which are often subcontractors or staff that don't typically give long terms and can't give long terms. So there's a snowball effect there, Sean. It's interesting that these findings have emerged at a time when the government is putting a bit more focus on this around the payment times reporting scheme, and it's given the regulator over the last few months more powers to really build on the effectiveness of that scheme in reducing payment times to those smaller business suppliers.
Stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles from McGrathNicol Advisory. Okay, Sean, so which sectors have performed well in 2024 and which sectors still have some room for improvement in terms of managing working capital and obviously cash flow as part of that?
There's often a few sectors that really stand out for us as being the most working capital intensive. And year on year, they're typically your building products or construction, like sectors or agriculture, and the net length of those cycles is sometimes up around 3, 4, 5 months. And that was the case this year again in 2024. This is mainly inventory driven. Companies in those sectors hold a lot of inventory. But as a positive for building products this year, that was one of only a few sectors we saw that they were actually able to reduce the average length of their collection cycles. So that means that there was a greater focus on customer management, perhaps in those sectors. Retail was actually the sector with the largest improvement. But to Jason's point, that was a sector that relied on stretching suppliers to achieve it. And at the other end, transport, which is often a sector where we don't see a heavy working capital load, a lot of the time it increased its days working capital by close to 3 days. But again, not surprising. This is a sector where using suppliers as a lever is difficult, given the nature of their supply. You think fuel and subcontractors and warehousing, rental, they're often, again, suppliers that don't give long term, so it's harder to use that as a lever in that sector.
Jason, how's the working capital performance of Australian companies stack up against the rest of the world?
Yeah, in Australia, I think we always try and look to the rest of the world for best practice. But in working capital, we are in many sectors and many businesses best practice. So if you look at those 3 metrics again, how long does it take for us to collect from our customers? Well, we were better than the 3 markets we looked at. We looked at the US, we looked at Europe, and we looked at Asia. And on average, Australian companies collect more quickly from their customers. They also, on average, pay more quickly to their suppliers. So in those sort of 2 areas that we look for, which are sort of most in your control and how you're trying to really show excellence and let cash flow through your business, we're quite good. When it comes to inventory, it's a little more difficult because we always talk about, well, where Australia is situated in relation to its suppliers is often longer. And so it's quite difficult in Australia to manage inventory because you've got a longer lead time. And we saw that play out. So on average, the Australian companies hold 1.5 times more inventory than the US and in Asia. When we look at the Europe companies, there was a much more diverse outcome there. So it looked like Australia actually held, this year at least, about 1 time less than the Europe counterparts. So really some quite good metrics that where Australia is doing and managing working capital well, it's managing it really well compared to those international entities as well. So it's a pretty good result.
So what about the inventory heavy sectors like retail? Obviously, we've had a couple of years of supply chain disruptions. How are they performing, and how should management teams continue to navigate that whole supply chain issue, stock management, that type of thing over the next 12 months, given we still have a fair bit going on?
It's been a really difficult period for retail. Retail has been one of those sectors that when we had the initial onset of COVID, there were a lot of fears about retail. And then midway through that first few months, we could see that actually retail was the sector that did by far and away the best, because you had people cooped up, a little bit more money in their pocket with nothing else to do. And so shopping was something that many people turned to. So retail's been a really good example of how difficult it has been in Australia to manage inventories over the last 3, 4, 5 years. So they've had to contend with supply chain disruption. So we had, in the first few years of that COVID era, we had some real sort of a lack of reliability in terms of how long it would take to get your supply if you ordered it. So that was very difficult, because you've got to try and buy with enough time for the stock to be on your shelves for when people want to purchase from you. So that was very difficult. Then we had an enormous cost imposition. How much it cost you to purchase and get your inventory to Australia was very difficult. Transport costs and shipping costs were sometimes 20, 30-fold. So that sometimes led you to not only having to invest more in that inventory supply chain, it also meant that some people thought, well, if I'm going to get a shipment, I might as well buy a little more sometimes so that I can lower the average transport cost. So it's been a very difficult period. Then you've had very variable demand. So it's been a really difficult period. So we're not surprised that over the course of this last 12 months, we've seen inventories drift up again, because it's just been very difficult to work out where demand is. We've continued to see a period of consumer sentiment that's quite negative, and that impacts so many other sectors. But consumers have been resilient in actually what they are spending. So people trying to manage their working capital cycle and that inventory timeframes and that regularity of new stock arriving has been incredibly difficult. I think that'll continue over the next year as we move into a period of hopefully some more positive consumer sentiment. And so those businesses that rely on that will really need to make sure they've tightened up their supply chain in the next 12 months.
Okay, so Sean, given what Jason has just said, where we are now, how should businesses approach cash flow forecasting?
Again, it's a really good question, Sean. We see an intrinsic link between working capital and cash flow forecasting. It's critical for businesses, whether they're large or small. In the current environment, what I'd call out is the importance of short-term forecasting, typically set up over a 13-week rolling basis to capture what would be a full working capital cycle for most organisations. And we think forecasting in this way helps do a few things. It shows the real cash runway for a business. So how much cash have I got? How long is it going to last if I keep trading the way I'm currently trading? It also works out any immediate funding needs, which are becoming really important for business. And we're seeing some level of re-emergence of working capital type finance as well. So it can really help in that regard. And if done properly, we think short-term forecasting is a useful tool to really test the length of the working capital cycle and how that cycle compares to the terms that have been agreed by companies with their suppliers and their customers. So really a critical part of working capital management. And Jason and I think it's really the starting point for good, strong working capital management overall.
Jason, wrapping it up, what's your advice to business and finance leaders for achieving best practice when it comes to working capital management?
Every year when we do this piece of work, Sean, people say we're surprised by the figures. And you can, and we're not really. You can see there's something happening in the market. It does impact working capital cycles, and it usually plays out in this number. What we are surprised every year is the disparity between the best and the worst. It's amazing that within sectors, there's often 100 days, sometimes more, 100 days difference between the tightest working capital cycle and the longest. And wow. That is surprising. And that is just such a comparative advantage that you can achieve over the rest of your sector and just your business, and it goes to business health. And how do you do it? It's not easy, but it takes sustained improvement. We also see a lot of businesses try and manage working capital around reporting periods. So try and hold back payments or collect payments and do it once a year or twice a year around a reporting period. And that often doesn't work because it places strain on people and relationships. What does work is a framework of sustained improvement over a period of time. And that takes a process. We often say, map that process. What is your working capital cycle for each of those elements? Map that and put together a procedure for improvement of each of those elements. How long does it take us to bill? Who does the billing? What do we do about collections? Who does the ordering? How is that ordering linked to the sales process? What are our relationships with our suppliers? What levers do we have? All of those should be written down in a procedures manual, like most other things are in a professional business. And then assign responsibilities to that so that people know what their part is to play in that. If you get that right, this just works. It does improve. What we've seen is almost all of the research we've done for 12 years, when we look at the best performers and you look in their annual reports, the CFO or the CEO or the board members that are commenting on what they've done in that year will say we focused on it, and we focused on it over a period of time. And the final thing I would do is track it, have some KPIs and track it so that you make working capital as visible as the other metrics in your business. It should be one of the main metrics in your business because it impacts how quickly your profit becomes cash. And who wouldn't want that to be as fast as it can be?
Jason, Sean, thanks for talking Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Jason Ireland and Sean Wiles, partners at McGrathNicol Advisory, which is a great supporter of this podcast. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.